In this video, we will look at verifying trigonometric identities, and this is actually going to be a relatively short video today. So in order to verify trigonometric identities, there are 4 steps to consider. Right? This is not exhaustive, meaning that these aren't the only steps, and really to call them steps is incorrect. These are more like recommendations. So the first is to work on one side of the equation. It is usually better to start with the more complex side, as generally it is easier to simplify something than to build. Second is to look for opportunities to factor expressions, square a binomial, or add fractions. Third, noting functions are in the final expression. Look for opportunities to use previously known identities and make proper substitutions. And finally, if these steps do not yield the desired result, try converting all terms into sines and cosines. Next, remember, every trigonometric function can be written as a sine or a cosine or some combination of sine and cosine. And now we're going to use the rest of this video to just look at several examples. So the first we're going to do is we're going to verify that the tangent of theta times the cosine of theta is equal to the sine of theta. So what we do, start with the more complicated side. Well, in that case, that would be the left-hand side right over here. So start with tan of theta times cosine of theta. Well, tangent is sine of theta over cosine of theta. And now we can see that the cosine of theta over cosine of theta is 1, and we're left with the sine of theta, which is what we desired, and so the verification process is complete. Next, let's go ahead and verify this. Now again, the more complicated side is the left-hand side. Now, secant squared theta minus 1 is one of the Pythagorean identities. 1 plus tangent squared is equal to secant squared, so secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. Now at this point, let's write everything in terms of sines and cosines. So tangent squared would be sine squared over cosine squared. Secant squared is 1 over cosine squared. Remembering that when you're dividing two fractions, we multiply the numerator, the top fraction, by the reciprocal of the bottom fraction. Now again, we have cosine squared theta is equal to 1, and we're left with sine squared of theta. This is what we wanted to verify, and so the verification process is complete. All right, let's look at this one. Now again, the more complicated expression is on the left-hand side, so work with this. All right, we're going to start with the even and odd properties of sine and cosine. Remember that sine is odd and cosine is even. Which means that sine of negative theta is negative sine of theta, and cosine of negative theta is positive cosine of theta. Now, the numerator doesn't really change, right, because it's being squared, so we're still left with sine squared. Now it's sine squared theta minus cosine squared theta over sine of negative sine of theta minus cosine of theta. Now we're going to take two steps here. We're going to do factoring this. This is a difference of two squares. So that becomes sine of theta plus cosine of theta times sine of theta minus cosine of theta. And we're going to factor out a negative down here. And write that as sine of theta plus cosine of theta. And now we can see we have a sine theta plus cosine theta in the numerator, a sine theta plus cosine theta in the denominator. They cancel out. We're going to be left with negative sine of theta minus cosine of theta. Distribute that negative through, and we get cosine of theta minus sine of theta. That was our desired result, and so the verification process is complete. And the last identity that we're going to look at in this video is 1 minus cosine squared of x times 1 plus cotangent squared of x is equal to 1. Now again, we're going to consider the left-hand expression. And we're going to expand. So we get 1 plus cotangent squared x minus cosine squared x minus cosine squared x times cotangent squared x. Now, if we look at this term right here, the 1 plus cotangent squared, that is a Pythagorean identity. That becomes cosecant squared x we can factor out a negative cosine squared x here. We're left with 1 plus cotangent squared x, which is, of course, cosecant squared. We can now factor out a cosecant squared x and be left with 1 minus cosine squared x, which is sine squared. Now cosecant squared is 1 over sine squared. So we have sine squared over sine squared. That is just 1. That is what we wanted. And so the verification process is complete. Right, the best way to get better at verifying identities like this is to just do them. Right, so go back through the previous videos where we looked at the trigonometric functions when we first introduced them. Become very familiar with those identities that were introduced, and then just do these. Now in the next video, we will begin looking at some very useful identities. So we're going to be adding to our list of identities